Welcome to the debate. If you were handed the power to design a society from absolute scratch, what would you actually do? Would you plant a garden, tending to the soil, respecting the natural limits of the climate, and patiently waiting for it to grow? Or would you build a massive machine, grab a wrench, and force the gears to turn to your exact specifications?
Right, the classic divide.
Exactly. When we consider the fundamental structure of human governance, we are essentially forced to choose between these two distinct realities. We either see the state as an organic outgrowth of human nature, which is messy, natural, and limited by our own psychology, or we see it as an engineered instrument, a piece of technology built to forcefully transform reality.
And that distinction, that tension between organic growth and mechanical engineering is exactly what we're dissecting today. We are asking the ultimate question: what is the fundamental purpose and nature of the state?
It doesn't get much bigger than that.
No, it doesn't. And we aren't dealing in hypotheticals today. We are framing this disagreement around two radically opposed, historically monumental paradigms drawn directly from our source material. On one hand, we have the classical Greek framework, which views the state as a natural community designed to cultivate the ethical, good life.
Yeah, the Aristotelian model.
Precisely. And on the other hand, we have a uniquely modern, highly centralized vision of the state as a hierarchical weapon, an instrument for historical state building, class struggle, and forced societal evolution.
Let's lay our cards on the table then. I represent the classical Aristotelian perspective. My position is that the state, the polis, is a natural association grounded in a stabilizing middle class and the psychological reality of private property, existing solely to cultivate virtue and allow human beings to achieve the good life.
And I represent the opposing view, specifically the Stalinist perspective, augmented by the sophisticated theoretical frameworks provided by philosophers like Alexander Kojève and Boris Groys. I argue that the state is a necessary, powerful instrument wielded by a proletarian vanguard, explicitly designed to eliminate class exploitation through mass collectivization and ultimately to usher in a post-historical universal reality.
So let's start by unpacking the bedrock of how these two systems even justify their own existence. If we look at Aristotle's most significant work of political philosophy, the Politics, the premise is beautifully biological.
Biological, yes, not historical.
Right, biological. The state is a natural growth. It isn't an artificial construct, and it certainly isn't a machine built to subjugate its citizens. It evolves. Aristotle looks at human beings and sees a teleology.
A built-in purpose.
Exactly, a built-in purpose. Just as the purpose of an acorn is to become an oak tree, the purpose of a human being is to live in a political community.
But I mean, how does he leap from an acorn to a complex, stratified government apparatus? That's quite a jump.
Well, through natural progression, it begins with the most fundamental human association, the household. The household exists for mere daily survival, right? Reproduction, basic sustenance.
Sure.
But humans need more than just a roof and a meal, so households naturally band together to form villages. Villages can trade, they can defend each other. But even a village isn't entirely self-sufficient.
It lacks a complete legal framework, for one.
Exactly. Eventually, villages coalesce into the state, the polis. This is the apex of human development. This is why Aristotle famously defines man as zoon politikon, a political animal. Our natural habitat is the state. If you can exist entirely outside of this community, Aristotle notes, you are either a beast or a god.
You are not human.
You are not human.
I come at it from a different way, because the very concept of a natural state is, from a Marxist-Leninist perspective, a profound illusion.
An illusion? How so?
You're describing a biological process, but human history isn't biology. It's economics. It's material reality. The state isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon like, say, a beehive.
I mean, Aristotle actually uses the bee analogy.
He does, but a beehive doesn't have a police force. A beehive doesn't have property laws that allow a fraction of the bees to hoard all the pollen while the rest starve. The state, as historical materialism demonstrates, is always the product of irreconcilable class conflict.
So it's born of friction, not growth.
Exactly. It arises precisely when a society splits into groups with opposed economic interests. The state is the organized political expression of the decisive economic class. It is an apparatus of power, a blunt instrument used by one class to suppress another.
But if it's merely a tool of suppression, a weapon, why do humans consistently form states across all cultures and all eras, even before advanced, industrialized economic classes existed?
They form communities, yes. We aren't denying social behavior. But the state, the apparatus of coercion, the courts, the military, the prisons, that arises to manage the friction of inequality.
I see.
Aristotle's model explicitly relied on the subjugation of slaves and laborers to allow free men the leisure to philosophize, right? His natural state was just the ideology of an exploiting class naturalizing their own dominance.
Well,
Let me just add, Stalin, building on Lenin and Marx, recognized that if you want to reach true communism, a classless society, you can't just plant a seed and wait. The proletarian state had to be utilized as a weapon to force the issue.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective on the appeal of these modern engineered states before I defend the organic growth model.
Go ahead.
The modern impulse, and this is exactly what Stalinism taps into, is to view the state as a tool to solve specific socioeconomic problems rapidly. It's like a surgeon's scalpel.
Or a sledgehammer, depending on the decade.
Right, exactly. It offers the illusion of immediate sweeping progress. You look at a backward agrarian society and you say, we can fix this in 5 years if we just pull the right levers.
And they did pull them.
But this mechanistic view ignores the fundamental psychology of human beings. It treats citizens as raw material, as iron ore to be melted down in a blast furnace rather than participants in an ethical community. The state must reflect human nature, not seek to forcefully overwrite it.
But what if human nature, as you define it, is just the accumulated habits of thousands of years of economic exploitation?
I don't believe our fundamental psychology is just a byproduct of economics.
Well, Stalin argued that in the face of capitalist encirclement and internal resistance, the state must actually increase in power to reshape those habits. The goal isn't the subjective, vaguely defined happiness that Aristotle talks about. The goal is historical transformation.
By any means necessary?
Boris Groys frames this brilliantly when he describes the Stalinist state not as a passive gardener, but as an active artist, demiurge.
An artist demiurge. Let's unpack that term for a moment, because it sounds incredibly abstract. What does it actually mean for a state to act as a demiurge?
A demiurge, in classical philosophy, is the artisan creator of the physical universe. Groys points out that the avant-garde artists of the 1920s in Russia, painters like Malevich, designers like Tatlin.
The constructivists.
Exactly. They dreamed of overcoming the limits of earthly, mortal creativity. They didn't just want to paint pictures on canvas. They wanted to mold society itself into a geometric, perfectly rational form. Under Stalin, that avant-garde dream was actually realized, albeit brutally.
So the state became the artist.
The state became the ultimate artist. It took the whole of society as its plastic material.
So society is just a ball of clay to be smashed and reformed at the whim of the state? That's horrifying.
In a transitional period, yes, it's a harsh reality. Think about the Soviet necessity for rapid industrialization. They had to overcome centuries of historical backwardness to build the material basis for socialism.
But at what cost?
You cannot grow a steel mill like a tree. You cannot organically evolve an electrical grid across a massive continent in a decade. It must be engineered. And the people must be engineered to operate it.
And there is the precise divergence regarding the structural purpose of the state. If we look at Aristotle's Politics, he is quite explicit that the state is a human organism composed of unlikes. It is not a uniform block of clay to be molded into a geometric shape. He uses the brilliant analogy of sailors on a ship.
Ah, yes, I know the analogy. The rower, the pilot, the lookout.
Exactly. The sailors all have different specific functions. The precise definition of virtue for the pilot is entirely different from the virtue of the rower. The pilot needs to understand the stars and the wind. The rower needs physical endurance.
Right, division of labor.
But they share a common object, which is safety and navigation. Similarly, the citizens of a state differ from one another, but the salvation of the community is their common business. This implies a profound unity in diversity.
But doesn't that analogy perfectly highlight the flaw in Aristotle's thinking?
How so?
You speak of the salvation of the community, but the Marxist framework asks, which community?
The polis as a whole?
But Aristotle's unity in diversity was a unity of wealthy, free men. What about the galley slaves chained to the oars? Is their shared goal the safety and navigation, or is their goal simply to not be whipped to death?
Well,
There is no shared goal when half the crew is legally bound to row until they die so the pilot can sit on the deck and contemplate philosophy.
that is a fair critique of ancient Greek socioeconomic realities, and I absolutely acknowledge the severe moral limitations of Aristotle's historical context. His defense of natural slavery is a glaring failure from our modern vantage point.
It's foundational to his economic model, though.
Yes, but you are attacking the historical application, not the structural concept. Aristotle vehemently critiques Plato's desire for rigid, absolute uniformity in the state. Plato wanted to erase the individual entirely for the sake of the collective.
Which sounds a bit like the avant-garde dream.
Exactly. For Aristotle, the state provides an ethical framework where the golden mean and the rule of law prevail over arbitrary dictation. Ethics and politics are completely inseparable.
But ethics are shaped by material conditions. Ethics are shaped by human nature. The state is the only venue where true justice can be actualized. When you reduce the state to a mere weapon in a class war, as Stalin did, you strip it of its ethical purpose entirely. You replace bourgeois ethics with proletarian historical necessity. You turn it into an engine of continuous violence. If the state is just an artist demiurge molding the clay, then the citizens have no intrinsic rights. They are just material.
They are historical agents. Stalin recognized that the enemies of socialism will never surrender their privileges voluntarily. The state must be powerful because the friction of moving from capitalism to communism generates immense heat.
But that brings us to a profound contradiction in the Stalinist ideology itself. Let's look at traditional Marxist theory for a second.
Sure. Marx and Engels argued that the state is an instrument of class oppression. Therefore, once the proletariat seizes power, nationalizes the means of production, and abolishes class distinctions, the state is supposed to wither away.
The famous withering away of the state.
Exactly. It should become completely obsolete. The government of persons is replaced by the administration of things.
That was the orthodox expectation, yes.
Yet, if the state is merely this temporary instrument to resolve class conflict, why did Stalin argue it must grow vastly stronger rather than wither away? By the 1930s, the capitalist class in the Soviet Union had been liquidated. The means of production were collectivized.
Internally, mostly, yes.
By Marxist logic, the state should have been packing its dags. Instead, the coercive apparatus reached unprecedented heights of totalitarian control. The secret police expanded, the Gulag system metastasized. You cannot claim the state is a temporary historical instrument if its primary function becomes its own endless, terrifying expansion.
That is an excellent point, and it's exactly the theoretical knot Stalin had to untie at the 16th and 18th Party Congresses. He argued that the state cannot wither away as long as capitalist encirclement exists.
So it's always external forces to blame? That's a convenient excuse.
Not entirely external. The threat of imperialist intervention was real. Look at the foreign intervention during the Russian Civil War. But there was also the persistence of internal saboteurs, the remnants of the exploiting classes who adapt and hide.
The hidden enemies.
Yes. Ernest Mandel touches on this when he discusses the transitional society. The proletariat must exercise state power against all those who might wrest power from it.
But Mandel was a Trotskyist who ultimately heavily criticized the Soviet bureaucracy.
He did. But his analysis of the necessity of the transitional state is relevant here. Yes, Stalin's approach was a massive deviation from the orthodox expectation of an immediate withering, but Stalin viewed it as a dialectical necessity.
A dialectical necessity to create a police state.
He argued the state must achieve its absolute maximum power and concentration to finally crush the remnants of class society worldwide before it can ever be dismantled. It is the ultimate expression of political will attempting to break the blind, anarchic forces of historical capitalism. The state doesn't wither by slowly fading out, it withers by becoming so totally encompassing that it absorbs all of society into itself,
at which point it ceases to be a state in the oppressive sense.
That sounds like a terrifying piece of rhetorical gymnastics to justify a permanent dictatorship. We must become totally oppressive in order to achieve total freedom.
It is dialectical. The synthesis emerges from the extremes.
Let's ground this dialectic in something tangible then. Because the way this immense political will organizes the material lives of its people is where the rubber meets the road.
The economy.
Right. This brings us directly to the bedrock of how humans interact with their environment, the question of private property versus mass collectivization. You cannot separate the political state from the dirt under our feet.
Agreed. Property is the absolute dividing line between these two paradigms. Aristotle offers a staunch, remarkably prescient defense of private property. He views acquisition as a natural human instinct. Property is a necessary part of the household, and the art of acquiring it is essential because no one can live well or even live at all without the necessities of life.
But where does he draw the line between acquiring necessities and hoarding wealth? Because acquisition can be endless.
He does draw a line. He makes a strict distinction between household management, which acquires what is necessary and useful, and retail trade, which seeks unlimited wealth for its own sake. He despises the latter.
That's convenient. That he heavily critiqued Plato's vision of communism for the guardian class. Aristotle understood that property provides a deep psychological satisfaction. People love that which is their own.
People love power, and property is power.
Beyond mere selfishness, Aristotle understood that private property is the absolute prerequisite for civic responsibility and moral action. You cannot practice the virtue of generosity if you have nothing to give.
You wouldn't need generosity if wealth was distributed equally.
You cannot practice hospitality without a household to invite a guest into. Furthermore, Aristotle recognized the tragic flaw of collective ownership, what modern economists call the tragedy of the commons. He literally writes that what is common to the greatest number gets the least amount of care.
Because he couldn't conceive of a society where the collective good was internalized as a personal good.
Can you? If everyone owns the land, no one feels the individual responsibility to tend it. Who wakes up at 4 a.m. to fix the tractor if the tractor belongs to 30 million people?
The worker who understands his role in the socialist project.
In theory, maybe. Thus, Aristotle's ideal was clear. Individual ownership but common use. The property remains private, which fosters industry, care, and pride. But the cultural ethos of the polis encourages the owner to use their wealth for the benefit of friends in the community.
I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Go ahead.
Aristotle's individual ownership, common use, is a bourgeois utopian contradiction. It relies entirely on the moral goodwill of the property owner. It's the ancient equivalent of trickle-down economics.
It relies on civic virtue cultivated by the state.
Let the rich own everything, and we'll just culturally encourage them to be nice. History proves that this goodwill is virtually non-existent when material interests are at stake. Private property is not a natural instinct. It is a historical construct that serves as the very root of exploitation.
It is a reflection of human self-interest, which is natural.
Stalin recognized that you cannot build a socialist society while allowing the means of production and in an agrarian society that primarily means agriculture to remain in private hands. This is why he pushed for mass collectivization and the abolition of independent smallholders, the kulaks.
Through force.
If the state is going to engineer a new society, it needs absolute control of the calories.
And the cost of that control was engineered famine and the deaths of millions of peasants who simply wanted to farm their own land. The Holodomor is a testament to that engineering.
The historical reality of the collectivization period is undeniably tragic and violently contested. But let's examine the structural intent through the drafting of the 1936 Soviet Constitution.
Okay, let's look at the documents.
This was a pivotal moment where the state was defining its new reality. Stalin personally intervened in the drafts. When figures like Stetsky, Tal, and Yakovlev proposed an egalitarian interpretation where all citizens were simply defined as free laborers, Stalin struck it down.
Why? If the goal is a classless society, isn't free laborers the perfect designation?
Because it ignored the material reality of the transition. He insisted on a strict division, defining the USSR as a state of workers and peasants. Collectivization was not just about sharing. It was a mandate to utilize resources for the whole, directed by the state.
Directed from the top down.
Actually, look at the historical reality in the Kirov region during the public discussions of the 1936 Constitution. The source material reveals something fascinating. It wasn't just the state forcing collectivization from above. The collective farmers themselves actively agitated against the independent smallholders.
You mean they turned on their neighbors?
They demanded accountability. The collective farmers wrote letters to the state arguing that these independent farmers were defaulting on taxes, they were evading civic work like building local bridges, and they were fragmenting the arable land.
Right, so they used the state to punish them.
The collective farmers used the state's socialist discourse to demand that underutilized land be given to collective farms that would actually use it appropriately for the nation. This proves that collective ownership actively fostered a new, structural type of civic duty. It replaced the arbitrary, unreliable generosity of the Aristotelian elite with a mandated collective responsibility.
That's an interesting point, though. I would frame it differently. Isn't it revealing that this so-called new civic duty was expressed primarily through citizens weaponizing the state's discourse to seize their neighbor's land?
It was a reallocation of national resources.
That is exactly the strife Aristotle warned about when property is forcefully seized or collectivized. When you abolish the natural boundary of private ownership, you don't magically eliminate human greed or self-interest. You merely redirect it into political maneuvering, bureaucratic backstabbing, and state-sponsored theft.
It wasn't theft. It was the rational consolidation of resources for industrialization.
Tell that to the independent farmer whose livelihood was seized. Aristotle's view of individual pride translating into civic generosity in the polis wasn't just a utopian dream. It was practically demonstrated through institutions like liturgies in ancient Athens, where wealthy citizens were required by honor and custom to fund the navy or sponsor the theater.
Imposed by social pressure.
Yes, but it was a functioning, stable system based on human nature, not a radical psychological experiment. When the state controls all property, the individual is utterly stripped of agency. They become entirely dependent on a distant bureaucratic apparatus for their very survival. You don't have citizens anymore, you have dependents.
But the agency you speak of in the ancient polis was reserved for a microscopic elite. What agency did the slave have in Aristotle's system?
I've conceded the issue of slavery.
What agency did the manual laborer have, whom Aristotle explicitly said lacked the capacity for true virtue because their hands were dirty from work? Stalin's mass collectivization aimed to provide material security and his historical agency to millions who had previously been treated as literal beasts of burden by the aristocratic Russian landlords.
I do not defend the feudal realities of Tsarist Russia, nor do I defend ancient slavery. But in attempting to eradicate class exploitation, did Stalin not simply create a new, even more rigid hierarchy? This brings us to the crucial issue of social stratification and who actually holds power.
The vanguard of the proletariat holds power.
Let's see if that's true. Aristotle argues forcefully that the best, most stable form of practical government is a constitutional republic, a politeia, that relies heavily on a robust middle class.
A middle class is just a buffer zone designed to prevent the oppressed from overthrowing the oppressors.
It is a stabilizing ballast. Aristotle observes that the extreme factions in society are dangerous to the state. The ultra-rich tend toward arrogance, hubris, and oligarchy. They refuse to submit to authority.
True enough.
The extremely poor, on the other hand, are often consumed by malice, petty grievances, and they lack the practical leisure to acquire political wisdom. The middle class obeys the rule of law because they have enough property to be secure and invested in the system, but not so much wealth that they consider themselves above the law.
It's the politics of mediocrity. It aims for a stagnant equilibrium.
It aims for harmony. The structural concept of middle-class stability remains foundational to political science today. Aristotle envisioned a harmonious division of life stages for the ideal citizen, youth spent as warriors defending the state, middle age as legislators crafting the law, and old age as priests tending to the spiritual life. It is a vision of integrated, balanced participation over a lifetime.
That's a compelling argument, but have you considered that Stalinism completely inverted this pursuit of balance? Because balance doesn't build steel mills.
It builds stable societies.
Stalin explicitly privileged the working-class vanguard over the peasantry, and certainly over any bourgeois middle class. Let's go back to his edits to the 1936 Constitution. By dividing society into workers and peasants, he codified a hierarchy.
So much for equality.
Equality is a liberal concept, not a Marxist one, especially not during the dictatorship of the proletariat. Stalin believed the vanguard working class had to lead and shepherd the less historically developed peasantry into socialism.
Shepherd them or exploit them.
A peasant is tied to the rhythms of nature, to the soil, to petty trade. A factory worker is tied to the machine, to collective labor, to the future. This wasn't merely a linguistic distinction. It had harsh, tangible consequences.
What kind of consequences?
Tangible labor laws. Stalin restricted the 7-hour workday and yearly paid vacations specifically to the workers. He intentionally excluded the rural majority, the collective farmers, from these benefits.
So he exploited the peasantry to subsidize the industrial workers.
The state recognized that the vanguard carried the heaviest burden of industrializing the nation and steering the historical project. Therefore, they required specific material support and political supremacy. It was a conscious, hierarchical structuring designed not to maintain a stagnant Aristotelian balance, but to propel the society forward through the crucible of modernization.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. Because doesn't Stalin's vanguard simply recreate an aristocracy under a different name?
It's a meritocracy based on historical function.
You claim to have abolished the exploiting classes, but Ernest Mandel's Marxist critique of the Soviet state points out a glaring hypocrisy in this vanguard model.
Mandel focuses on the bureaucracy.
Yes, the nomenclatura. Mandel notes the invisible chains and the hierarchical structure of the Soviet state apparatus. He points out that in this apparatus, the top generals, the party secretaries, the high-level bureaucrats, they all earned the exact same salaries, shopped at the same exclusive stores, and enjoyed the same exclusive standard of living at their country dacha as the big bourgeoisie in capitalist countries.
There were material incentives to retain expertise, yes. You can't run a state on idealism alone.
It wasn't just incentives, it was a new class structure. Meanwhile, the mass of regular workers and collective farmers lived in deep poverty. The state apparatus was not a homogeneous instrument of the workers. It was a pyramid that recreated the exact structure of bourgeois society.
I wouldn't say the exact structure. They couldn't pass ownership of factories to their children.
But they passed down privilege and status. Stalin failed to abolish class. He merely replaced the capitalist elite with a bureaucratic elite, a new class that controlled the surplus social product. At least Aristotle was honest about his hierarchy. He didn't pretend the middle class was a temporary vanguard. He admitted they were the necessary rulers.
Mandel's critique highlights the deep contradictions of a transitional state. I won't deny that. It's a valid Marxist critique, but it misses the ontological shift that Kojève and Groys identified.
Ontological shift.
Yes, there was a bureaucratic hierarchy, a nomenclatura, but the nature of the power had changed. And this brings us to the ultimate goal of the state. What is the endgame?
Well, for Aristotle, the end game, the goal, is the good life. It is the moral and intellectual cultivation of the citizens. The state is fundamentally an educational institution.
A boarding school for aristocrats.
An institution that aims to adapt the citizen to the constitution of the city. Aristotle outlines stages of education: reading, writing, gymnastics, music, not just for utilitarian purposes, but to produce virtue.
Virtue defined by the ruling class.
The goal is human happiness and the leisure to contemplate the good. Without this ethical cultivation, Aristotle warns, man is the most unholy and savage of animals.
But for Stalinism, as theorized by Kojève and Groys, the ultimate goal is achieving a post-historical reality. It is the realization of the universal and homogeneous state, where the engine of history, which is class struggle, finally ceases. Groys introduces this fascinating concept of linguistification.
Linguistification. Explain how that operates in practice, because it sounds like academic jargon.
Think of it like this. Under capitalism, society is ruled by the mute, blind, non-verbal fate of money and the market. You can't argue with a market crash. You can't debate an algorithm that prices wheat.
It just operates.
Right. It's governed by decentralized supply and demand.
But Stalinist communism replaces money with language, specifically the discourse of dialectical materialism. The entire society is transcribed from the medium of money to the medium of language.
Meaning what? That if the state says a tractor factory is successful, it is successful regardless of the actual economics?
Meaning that reality is determined by conscious planning and ideological discourse, not by blind market forces. In this reality, Stalin operates as the Kojèvian sage, or the philosopher tyrant.
A dangerous combination.
He grasps the totality of historical contradictions and actively molds reality to fit the discourse. Consider Stalin's bizarre, highly significant 1950 intervention in the newspaper Pravda regarding linguistics.
I was hoping we would get to this. Why is the absolute ruler of a nuclear superpower spending his time writing theoretical articles on grammar?
Exactly. It seems absurd until you understand the framework. There was a prominent Soviet linguist named Mar who argued that language is a superstructure tied to a specific class, bourgeois language, proletarian language.
Right, that everything is class-based.
Yes. But Stalin intervened and published an article arguing that language is not a class construct, but a transhistorical creation of the entire society. It serves all classes equally.
And why did Stalin care about linguistic theory?
Because if language is class-based, then when communism is achieved and classes disappear, the language must also disappear or be violently revolutionized. Stalin couldn't have that instability. He needed language to be universal, because language, not the economy, had become the ultimate medium of communist society.
I see.
Society became a text to be written. The state was authoring a total artwork.
That is a chilling metaphor. Society is a text to be written by a single author. I'm not convinced by that line of reasoning, because it completely ignores the horrific cost of this so-called text.
Creating a new world requires breaking the old one.
But if this linguistification and this universal and homogeneous state represent the ultimate evolution of human governance, the final wisdom of the sage, why does it require an apparatus of absolute terror to maintain itself?
To enforce the new grammar, so to speak.
But that's my point. How can a society claim to have reached the end of history, a state of perfected rationality and discourse, when it must constantly enforce its reality through show trials, engineered famines, and the gulag?
Because there is resistance.
If the discourse is so perfectly rational, why doesn't anyone believe it without a gun to their head? Aristotle warned us, man without virtue is the most unholy and savage of animals. When the state ceases to be an ethical community aiming at virtue and instead becomes a vast, instrumental machine trying to rewrite human nature into a total artwork, the result is not post-historical wisdom. It is a descent into industrialized savagery.
That's a moral judgment on a historical process.
The violence of the Stalinist state isn't a byproduct. It is the core mechanism of its attempt to force an unnatural conformity upon a complex human reality.
The violence, seen through the structural lens of Groys's analysis, was the destructive side of the avant-garde total artwork. When a painter creates a completely new form on a canvas, he must paint over the old forms. The terror was the brutal, necessary force required to rip society out from under the mute, oppressive bedrock of capitalist accumulation and transcribe it into the conscious, planned medium of language and ideology.
You are equating the murder of millions to painting over a canvas.
I am explaining its functional logic within the paradigm of a state attempting to literally conquer historical time. I am not defending the morality of the Gulag, but look at the show trials. Groys points out that they were deeply discursive events.
They were kangaroo courts.
They weren't just about killing opponents. They were theatrical, linguistic spectacles where reality was retroactively altered by the state. The accused had to publicly confess and align their personal narrative with the state's grammar. The sage must administer the end of history, and in the context of a backward, besieged Russia in the 1930s, that administration took the form of absolute, terrifying sovereign power.
The state had to absorb all of society into itself so that the blind forces of the market could never return.
growth for some.
It must respect the psychological realities of private property, and it relies on the stabilizing force of a middle class to prevent the extremes of tyranny and mob rule. Above all, it insists that the state is fundamentally an ethical institution. It exists to cultivate the moral and intellectual virtues of its citizens so they might achieve the good life.
A noble, if antiquated, ideal.
The tragedy of the Soviet experiment stands as a monumental warning against the hubris of viewing the state as a raw, mechanistic instrument of total historical transformation. When you abandon the ethical constraints of natural law in favor of engineering a post-historical utopia, the state becomes a monster that consumes its own citizens in the name of progress.
And to summarize the opposing view, the Stalinist model, despite its undeniable and horrific brutality, represents the most ambitious attempt in human history to consciously engineer society. It attempted to eliminate the deeply ingrained systems of economic exploitation and replace the blind, anarchic forces of capitalism with the absolute rule of conscious discourse and rational state planning.
Through force.
Through the leadership of a vanguard, it sought to shatter the ossified class structures that Aristotle simply defended as natural. While it may have fallen tragically short of its utopian horizon, degenerating into bureaucratic terror, it fundamentally demonstrated that the state does not have to be a passive reflection of organic inequalities. It can be wielded as an active, demiurgic force to reshape human destiny and drag society toward the end of history.
It is deeply fascinating to note where these two wildly divergent philosophies actually converge. Both Aristotle and the architects of the Stalinist state ultimately see the individual as fundamentally subordinate to the collective.
They do. The liberal concept of the isolated, supreme individual doesn't exist in either framework.
Right. For Aristotle, the citizen belongs entirely to the state, exactly as the hand belongs to the body. You cannot sever the hand and still call it a hand. For Stalin, the citizen is a laborer mobilized for the construction of socialism. Yet they disagree completely on the mechanism of that subordination. Should the state carefully cultivate human nature like a gardener, pruning and guiding it, or must it radically, violently reinvent it like an industrial engineer smelting iron?
We have explored the deep theoretical underpinnings of this divide, looking at the mechanisms of property, stratification, and the ultimate telos of the state. But the immense complexity of defining the state's true purpose remains an open question. Our source material, from classical Greek text to the drafts of the Soviet Constitution and the philosophical reflections of Kojève and Greuze, offers endless layers regarding how governance shapes and is shaped by human reality.
There is always more to explore in these materials. We leave the ultimate judgment to you, the listener.
Indeed.
When you look out at the architecture of our political reality today, you must ask yourself, are we living in a forest that requires careful pruning or a machine that requires a new blueprint?